des choses qui se ressemblent. Quoi.
Oui, oui, j'ai vu.
C'est sur la même, c'est la même période, c'est pas exactement la même chose. Hein.
Oui, j'ai vu le fascicule, ça ressemblait.
C'était quoi l'année dernière? Sur l'exploration? Non, sur les loisirs?
Oui, c'est ça.
C'est ça.
Oui, c'est pas la même chose.
J'espère que vous avez vos documents, que j'ai oublié le truc pour projeter. J'ai oublié de le prendre. Alors déjà, pour info, donc ce qu'on va faire aujourd'hui, on va faire une heure de cours, enfin une heure, une fois que j'aurai donné mes infos. Et puis on gardera une heure pour faire un deuxième et derrière l'entraînement à l'oral.
Ouais, c'est.
Après, c'est autre dynamique.
Mais ça se ressemble. Comme la dernière fois, vous travaillez par petits groupes si vous le souhaitez. Oui, par petits groupes, parce que sinon on ne va pas y arriver pour après revoir ensemble les différents plans. Par groupe de 2, 3, 4 maxi. Vous faites un plan détaillé, vous me les envoyez, et ensuite la semaine prochaine, au début du cours, on prend une heure pour discuter les plans, ceux qui vont bien, qui ne vont pas bien, pourquoi, etc. Donc ça sera le deuxième entraînement, je préfère le faire là parce que après il reste 3 semaines de cours seulement et j'aurai besoin de ça pour traiter la question des femmes. Autre chose, donc, on vient d'avoir le calendrier des examens, non, vous ne l'avez pas encore, vous. A priori, ce que j'ai ne bougera plus. Donc, vous aurez vos 2 gros examens, enfin, 2 gros examens, oui, la littérature et la langue avant Noël. Donc ça, c'est... Eh oui. Eh oui, oui, mais imaginez comme vous serez soulagé après. Voilà, il vaut mieux. Alors, oui, est-ce que quelqu'un a une feuille de brouillon? Voilà. Est-ce que vous pouvez la faire passer? Et tous ceux qui veulent passer, tous ceux qui partent en Erasmus au 2e semestre, et qui veulent passer leur oral avant les vacances de Noël, m'écrivent leur nom ici. Uniquement les Erasmus, hein, je ne fais pas d'exception, hein, c'est juste les Erasmus. Ceux qui partent, ceux qui, en 2e semestre, partent en Erasmus et voudraient passer leurs examens en général, donc celui de civilisation, avant Noël, si possible. Et vous marquez aussi la date, à côté, vous mettez entre parenthèses la date où normalement vous devez être parti. Mettez celle de l'après-rentrée au départ. Hein, d'accord? Y compris le samedi. Mais il n'y a que des épreuves de L1 le samedi, a priori. Enfin, de ce que je sais. Même des épreuves de 14 à 17 le samedi. Non, non, c'est pour les L1, vous inquiétez pas, c'est pour les petits. Alors, je ne sais pas tout. Je ne sais pas tout. Hein. Attention, je n'ai que les dates pour l'anglais, moi. Donc, en gros, ça sera à vérifier, bien sûr, hein, parce que ce que je vous dis là, ils sont encore en train de travailler sur le calendrier. Normalement, ça ne bougera plus. En gros, a priori, le 20 après-midi, donc le jeudi, c'est ça? Jeudi 20 après-midi, 14h30, 18h30, il y aurait la littérature en amphi de Léage. Mais ça sera à vérifier, hein. Là encore, vous vérifierez sur votre convocation. Donc, a priori, le 20 décembre après-midi, il y aurait la littérature 502 et toujours a priori, le 21 après-midi, 14-18, il y aurait la langue. 501, 14-18. Donc, 2 après-midi, le 20 et le 21. Ce qui veut dire qu'à la limite, moi, je peux faire passer des oraux le 20 matin, le 21 matin, le samedi, on va essayer de éviter. Quoique, si je suis de surveillance. Bon, donc vous marquez, si vous êtes Erasmus, et uniquement dans ce cas, si vous êtes Erasmus de second semestre, vous marquez votre nom si vous voulez passer les examens le plus tôt possible pour l'oral, comme ça je préviendrai mes collègues, etc. Et voir le nombre de personnes concernées, et vous mettez entre parenthèses la date prévue de votre départ. Alors, après ça, c'est les 2 grosses épreuves, évidemment. Ouais. 14-18, je crois. Enfin, c'est l'après-midi, quoi. Toute l'après-midi. Après, donc le 22, il n'y a pas pour les L3 anglais, mais je ne parle que des épreuves d'anglais. Hein. Moi, je n'ai que les épreuves de bilingue, anglais et italien. Hein, donc, je ne sais pas pour le reste. Vous aurez ça bientôt, hein, maintenant. Ils vont publier ça assez vite, la semaine prochaine ou plus tard. Après, il va y avoir des épreuves quand même qui vont s'étaler jusqu'au bout, j'en ai peur. Par exemple, bon, la traductologie pour bilingue sera le 7 janvier. L'histoire des genres sera aussi le 7 janvier. Après, je vois l'école critique ou l'introduction au droit, etc. C'est le 9 janvier. École critique et l'introduction au droit, ça doit être pour la traduction, ça. Ouais. Le 9 janvier. 9 janvier. Qu'est-ce que je vois d'autre? La linguistique aussi le 9 janvier. Linguistique 50-104 pour ceux qui sont en enseignement secondaire. Après, ça repousse à tard. Oui, par exemple, c'est ça qui fiche tout en l'air pour ceux qui passeront en Erasmus. Il y a le marketing touristique et culturel qui est le 15 janvier. Marketing. Et puis le 16 janvier, il y a le tourisme et mémoire et tourisme culturel et interculturalité. Connaissance du monde pro. Didactique, c'est du... Ah, alors, elle m'a dit... Attendez, elle m'a envoyé ça. Le FLE sera... Je sais qu'elle m'a envoyé ça, je lui ai demandé. 11 et 12 janvier. Bon, ça vous donne une idée, déjà. Hein, vous allez recevoir le calendrier définitif sous peu. Et c'est à bien vérifier, hein, ne vous dites pas, elle a donné la date, la salle, c'est bon, il peut y avoir des changements. D'accord ? Pas de questions par rapport à ça, donc vous faites bien circuler la feuille et puis vous me la ramenez après qu'elle ne soit pas oubliée et que tout le monde ait pu... Pas de questions particulières. On vous enverra aussi très vite le nom de la personne qui sera votre référent pour l'activité intégratrice. Hein, donc j'attends quelques réponses et puis ensuite on vous enverra ça. Alors... Bien, alors on va continuer sur le... On va prendre une petite heure pour terminer la partie sur la pauvreté, la nouvelle visibilité de la pauvreté. Donc on va reprendre là où on s'en était arrêté. Alors je suis désolée, vous avez vos textes, vous pouvez... Oui, vous avez vos... Bon, vous allez vous débrouiller, vous mettez à côté de quelqu'un qui les a. J'ai oublié le... Il est dans mon bureau, mais le temps d'y aller, franchement, ça vaut pas le coup. Yeah, so we'll start first from, we've seen when we studied both Jack London's text, you remember, with his almost sensationalist vision of poverty, and his, voyeuristic vision of poverty. I think the word is particularly relevant here, voyeuristic. C'est tout, il y en a que 4, 5, 6, la dernière fois il y en avait au moins 15 qui avaient levé la main. Parce que quoi? Oui, ils sont pas là peut-être, mais... Peut-être que tout le monde n'est pas dans le groupe. Bah si, ils étaient dans le groupe quand l'autre fois ils ont levé la main. Non, mais je ferai le point avec les autres, hein, bien sûr. Mais... Donc tout le monde a rempli, hein, pour les Erasmus. Non mais tant mieux, hein, parce qu'il y avait 20 personnes, j'aurais du mal à les faire passer. Mais la dernière fois il me semblait qu'il y avait plus de monde. In Jack London's text, obviously the vision of poverty is at the same time a socialist approach. Jack London obviously, and this is the discourse that he has in his text, is here to defend the poor and to criticize the powers that be. He constantly repeats the expression, the powers that be. That is the government, of course, or the authorities, the political authorities, generally speaking. And throughout his text, he attacks these authorities. He blames them for the situation of the poor, but at the same time, in spite of this socialist discourse, socialist approach, there is obviously also a very, there is a distance that he establishes between himself and the poor. He describes them with a certain kind of disgust. He animalizes them, as we've said. He objectifies them, as we've said. And obviously, his descriptions are based on many generalizations. That is, he probably saw scenes, or such scenes as those he describes in The People of the Abyss, but from a few scenes that he saw, he generalizes to the whole of the neighborhood. He essentializes the poor of the East End and seems to be saying that all of them are similar and that all of them are like degraded animals living in filth and living in degradation. So you have this on the one hand. Then we saw the text by James Greenwood and the text by, so it's in UE 502 Going Public Week 7 to 9. Just after Jack London's text, there was a text by James Greenwood. So it's from page, sorry.
16, I think.
Yeah. It's just that my computer won't work, I don't know why. Yeah, so we had the text by Arthur Morrison, and this text is quite interesting because he takes us a kind of step away from the usual descriptions of Whitechapel, and he criticizes the way people have of generalizing about the East End and about the situation of the poor in this part of London. And he starts from the usual assumptions that the urban explorers of the time had, saying, using exactly the same words, a wilderness of crazy dens into which pallid wastrels crawl to die, wretches with everything beautiful, brave and worthy crushed out of them, nothing of the glory and nobleness and jollity of this world within the range of their crippled senses, rasp away their puny lives in the sty of the sweater, etc., etc. So here it's a kind of condensed version of all the urban explorers' accounts of Whitechapel at the time, with all the words that were usually used by these urban explorers. The notion of den. You know what a den is. Normally you use it for a lair or a den. For animals, for a wild beast, for a lion, for instance, a den, a lair. A den or a lair here is used to replace the word, which word?
Whitechapel?
Sorry?
Shelter?
Shelter? No, a more precise word.
For
than
Whitechapel?
that. No. No, for home. It's their home. The den is their home here. So you see, they transform, and through the use of a word like this, they transform the domestic reality into a kind of wilderness. The poor seem to be living in a kind of wilderness which does not look human in a way. So the use of the word den, which he mocks here, obviously, the use of the word den is particularly relevant. Another relevant aspect is the use of words like crawling to die, or crouching, or crawling, crouching, which are words which also normally you will use for animals most of the time. Well, sometimes a baby may be said to be crawling, but each time, whether for an animal or for a baby, it means that you are not what?
Mature, civilized?
Yeah, mature, civilized, absolutely. You're not mature yet, you're not civilized yet. And this notion of maturity, civilization, were very often associated at the time. So seeing the poor crouching, crawling, you remember the pictures I showed you about the so-called evolution of man, with the black man or the Irish man generally crouching, and then the white Anglo-Saxon standing erect as a kind of symbol of the apogee, of the climax of the human race. Well, this is typically the way people at the time, the Victorians or most Victorians, saw the evolution of humanity. And by describing the poor as crouching, crawling, they reduced them to the state of children, to the state of immature beings, to the state of animals. So this is the second type of vocabulary. Then you have all the vocabulary of darkness. Poverty is associated with darkness, and poverty is associated with darkness. And Morrison, when he mocks the way urban explorers saw poverty, makes no exception to the rule. It is associated with darkness because of the darkness of the streets. You remember how Gustave Doré, for instance, represented these streets. They are very dark. They are very narrow streets, which reinforces the darkness in them. Light is obviously, well, it does exist. Lamplights did exist at the time, but not in the pockets of poverty of Whitechapel, because even electric light had not reached Whitechapel yet, or it was only starting to reach Whitechapel yet. So, for instance, when Jack the Ripper killed his victims, there was all these fantasies about the narrow, dark, narrow streets where he killed his victims, because the light had not reached these parts of the city, and it was easy for Jack the Ripper to lurk in the background, in the shadows, and then attack his victims by surprise. So the notion of darkness, physical darkness, but also moral darkness is implied. The lack of knowledge, the lack of education, the lack of religion as well. And also this notion of filth, which is very, very present. Foul life, as is said. Wilderness. Pallid wastrels crawl to die. The notion of pallor, the notion that those people, the poor, were very pale. This is very often stressed. Why, according to you? Why this paleness?
To show they don't have enough food to eat, or they're sick?
Yeah, it's probably due to this, of course, but it was also one of the main diseases of the time, especially in poor neighborhoods. Well, two diseases, in fact.
Tuberculosis?
Tuberculosis, yes, tuberculosis. Many people suffered from tuberculosis, which generally makes you look pale. But there's another one, which was considered even more disgusting. No, not the plague, not at the time.
Anemia?
No, well, anemia is the consequence of the disease, but no. Syphilis, yes, syphilis. Syphilis, a sexual disease associated with prostitution. So syphilis, when in late 19th century texts, you have the description of pallid women with red lips. Very often they refer to prostitutes, the red lips, because makeup was very, when you made up your lips with red, especially rouge, as it was called at the time, it very often implied, and especially if you were seen in the streets on your own, it often implied that you were a prostitute, or at least this is how people saw you. And the pale complexion was also a sign of syphilis. So the pallid, the reference to pallid faces is also a reference to disease, tuberculosis, syphilis, among others. So you see how here, even if Morrison eventually tries to demonstrate that these are generalizations and that there are indeed pockets in Whitechapel and in other places in East London in which this type of poverty can be seen, this type of destitution can be seen, you cannot generalize to the whole of Whitechapel. And the rest of his article is going to try to show the more respectable, commercial respectability of Whitechapel, as he calls it. There are many other evidences of the commercial respectability of Whitechapel. So he presents the neighborhood rather as a commercially respectable neighborhood. But at the end of his text, he's going to focus on just a few streets, what I've just called pockets of destitution, within the East End, when he starts speaking about, it's page 15, the last paragraph. But long may Sandys Row remained for the benefit of the disappointed pilgrim to Petticoat Lane. These are typically streets of the East End. They still exist today. Well, now you have yuppies spending their day outside the pubs, but at the time they were very, very poor neighborhoods. Why the other end of Middlesex Street is called Sandys Row, we cannot imagine, unless the sprouting respectability of the former disdains association with the humble grime of the latter. So he's going to make the opposition between respectable poverty and what at the time was very often called vicious poverty. This was the adjective that was used. And here, he's going to use the same words as the other urban explorers who generalized on the whole of London. For where Middlesex Street dwindles into Sandys Row, the pavement is narrow and often encroached upon by the stock of the shops, and the intrepid explorer slips and staggers on the foul, greasy slime which carpets the irregular cobblestones of the roadway. In the murky, dusty gloom of the old clothes shop, no patch of the wall can be seen, and all but a scant passageway in each shop seems a solid conglomeration of unhealthy-looking stock. Jewesses of enormous circumference block these passageways, and unclean Jews of the very lowest class, with unkempt hair and rancid complexions, keep a sharp lookout over the articles which hang in heavy bunches in the street, occasionally smoothing or rearranging them with their black-nailed paws. Old military stores and accoutrements, I don't know how to pronounce this word in English, and rusty mildewed saddlery form a large proportion of the things offered for sale. And who in the world buys them and what they do with them when they get them are mysteries we have never penetrated. Mangy busbies, battered lances, helmets, and even the three-cornered hats Greenwich pensioners wore years ago, who can have any possible use for these? And there are wooden water bottles in a state of defilement which would prevent a pig drinking from them, and odoriferous knapsacks and wallets over which no respectable slug would crawl. Then there are equally enigmatic bundles of rust-eaten bayonets, bundles of broken spurs, and hammerless pistols of the most useless character. Who in creation wants these things, and how do these shopkeepers extract a living from them? Well, try to focus on this paragraph and try to underline the different words and expression which James Greenwood has criticized in other urban explorers' accounts, and which he's using exactly in the same way here, debasing the people that he describes. Well, it is particularly true of the Jews that he describes here. You've seen how he speaks of these Jewish people. A Jewess, he starts with, well, first the street is slimy. So obviously you have cobblestone, but there is mud around the cobblestone. So it's already very dirty. There's this notion of dirt already. This notion of dirt, which is reinforced by the fact that the shops seem to be completely packed with useless things, old useless things. But what is particularly interesting is the way he describes the people. Jewesses of enormous circumference block these passageways, and unclean Jews of the very lowest class, with unkempt hair and rancid complexions, keep a sharp lookout over the articles which hang in heavy bunches in the street, occasionally with their black-nailed paws. What can you say about this sentence in particular? What is the word used in the sentence which immediately animalizes the Jews described? Paws, and black-nailed paws. So they're dirty, and they look like animals. They don't have hands, they have paws. You see? So obviously here, the animalization process is very obvious. He doesn't hide the idea that he compares them with animals. And there is also an essentialization of the Jews described here. It seems that all Jewish women are, and I like the expression, are very fat, yes, of big circumference, enormous circumference, so they are very fat, so fat that they block the entrance, according to him. And it also seems that all Jewish people, or at least the poor Jewish people, are very unclean, dirty, again. See as well the way he refers to these Jewish people, saying of the very lowest class, of the very lowest class. Yeah. James Greenwood. Non, attendez. Page 15. Oui, c'est ça. Pourquoi? Ah, j'ai dit Greenwood, oui, pardon, c'est Morrison. Pardon, oui, Arthur Morrison, sorry. Yeah, it's Arthur Morrison. Well, Greenwood says more or less the same thing, but it's Arthur Morrison, sorry. So it's end of page 15. Yeah, so, sorry. So, unclean, fat, very lowest class, and I would say that in lowest class, I guess there is not only this notion of social class. It seems to be, it's almost as if he had used the word race here. The word race and class, the words race and class were used almost interchangeably at the time. And this is the case, obviously, here. He's of the lowest category of human beings. This is what he means, more than of the lowest social class. The rancid complexion. Rancid is exactly the same idea as, well, it's not pale, it's rather yellow, you know, as if you were sick, as if you were diseased. And also, which is a very essentialist feature, very often said about Jewish people, a stereotype, a cliche, the fact that he keeps a sharp lookout over the articles which hang in the sharp look. Very often in the description of Jewish people, you have this idea of the sharp look, as if they were constantly on the lookout for something, you see. As if they were constantly checking that nobody was going to attack them. Well, this is a stereotype that you find in many texts. And also, what is interesting is when the text says, who in creation wants these things, and how do these shopkeepers extract a living from them? Who in creation wants these things seems to be implying that they are not even part of the human world, that what they do for a living and what they try to sell for a living is not even adapted to the human world, to normal human beings. So again, it seems to reject these poor people, and I think the fact they are poor is more important to him than the fact they are Jews at this point. It's their poverty which makes them other. Their Jewishness also makes them other, obviously, but their poverty even further others them from him. And this is what we find here. And in the next paragraph, or the next, not the next one, the second next, Fashion Street, Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, Wentworth Street, through which shall we go to Brick Lane, black and noisome, the road sticky with slime, and palsied houses, rotten from chimney to cellar, leaning together, apparently by the mere coherence of their ingrained corruption, dark, silent, uneasy shadows passing and crossing, human vermin in this reeking sink, like gobbling exhalation from all that is noxious around. Women with sunken black-rimmed eyes whose pallid faces appear and vanish by the light of an occasional gas lamp and look so like ill-covered skulls that we start at their stare. Horrible London? Yes. So again, the same expression, and again, the use of the word human vermin. It's very strong to say of someone that is just human vermin. It's not only animals, it's animals that you want to get rid of, which is completely different. It's not even comparing them to cows or to dogs. It's comparing them to vermin. That is something you want to crush, something you want to get rid of. And here, obviously, you see the whole issue at stake in Urban Explorer's account, this complete distance that they put between the poor they discovered, that became visible, and themselves. So this process of othering that you can find in James Greenwood's text, that you can find in all the other texts included in the booklet, this othering process is also, or was also, a way for the explorers of the time to establish a kind of reassuring distance. A kind of reassuring distance from the ones that they thought were so different. You had exactly the same process with foreigners. By insisting on the so-called difference between the poor or foreigners and themselves, they, in a way, reassured themselves about their humanity. They reassured themselves about the fact that, or so they thought, were superior to these people. So this process of othering, which is at stake, obviously, in all these texts, is a way to reassure yourself. In a way, this process expresses a certain fear of the unknown, of what they discovered, and of what was new to them, because before, even if poverty existed, it was less visible. So it expresses a fear of the unknown, a fear of the unknown which is sometimes tinted with fascination. And we'll read an article which expresses this very well. And critics very often analyze urban explorers' accounts as ways to experience vicariously. You understand vicariously? Yeah or no? No. Vicariously, ça veut dire par procuration. Vicariously. V-I-C-A-R-I-O-U-S-L-Y. Yeah, they very often analyze these texts and these descriptions, these exaggerated descriptions, as a way to experience vicariously situations that would have been impossible to experience openly in Puritan Victorian life. For instance, scenes of sexual promiscuity, as they said, seeing men and women fooling around in the streets, for instance. These scenes of sexual promiscuity that they wrote about them very indignantly in a way, but at the same time you feel the fascination there is in them. Same thing with popular street entertainment. When you read the accounts of urban explorers or written by urban explorers about street entertainments, very often they are indignant. They say that they are disgusted by what they see, by the dog races, the rat races sometimes, the violence of these games. And at the same time, it is absolutely demonstrated that many rich people went in disguise to the poor neighborhood to attend these games, because they found a certain kind of thrill in attending these games. These games which would have been impossible in their wealthy neighborhoods. So there was this very ambivalent feeling towards these vicarious experience. When they went there, they could say that you know, that their intentions were either philanthropic intentions or scientific intentions, you know, investigative intentions, but it was also to get the thrill of this life, which was so different from their life. So at the same time frightening, but fascinating. You remember when we spoke about the freak shows, we had exactly the same type of approach. The fact that the freak shows were sold in a way or promoted as a way to know more, scientifically speaking, about the evolution of man. So people went there and made as if they learned something from a scientific point of view, which was not true at all, because all that was said in these freak shows was completely was a lie. But at the same time, they had this pretext to go and attend such freak shows, which thrilled them, obviously, because they discovered people that were completely different from them, people who frightened them in a way, because at the same time they looked like them, but were different from them, and people who, in a way, they were attracted to, for morbid reasons, most of the time, but still they were attracted to them. So this notion of voyeurism, this notion of thrill that they wanted to experience vicariously was very, very present. Yes, so in the late 19th century, when the labyrinth of the city, whether the city be London, Paris, St. Petersburg, New York, etc., or Manchester, Liverpool, the labyrinth of the city was still to be discovered, was still to be mapped, exactly as Africa was to be mapped. The city at home was still to be mapped, geographically speaking, because the city had not been explored completely yet. It had not been mapped yet, at least concerning the poor parts of the city. And at the time when the labyrinthine city was still to be mapped, urban explorers projected their own fantasies on what they discovered in the poor neighborhoods. This is the main idea, I think, that should be remembered. If you take the article, week 7 to 9, the article entitled Human Narratives, Bodies and Detail in Late Victorian Work, you have on page, well, it must be page 5 of the article, the part starting Humanitarian Narrative, Bodies and Detail in the Late Victorian City. It's page 5. And yeah, and in this part of the article, the critic writes, in the autopsy report of the early 18th century, the gruesome particulars of the post-mortem were exposed for the first time in minute and unflinching detail. And then next paragraph, as one might expect, there are some similarities and differences between this new kind of factual medical reportage and the humanitarian narratives of the late 19th century. By the latter periods, there had become established certain styles and conventions in fiction and non-fiction writing for conveying verisimilitude and showing the scrupulous honesty of humanitarian as guides to slum life. There was, in fact, a great deal of blurring of the boundary between fact and fiction in late Victorian humanitarianism. Novelists drew inspiration from factual narratives, paraphrasing the reports of philanthropic organizations and borrowing plots and characters from case material in order to represent social and spiritual truths about the wretched lives of the urban poor. So the idea which is interesting here is first the notion of verisimilitude, that is in the late 19th century, the urban explorers, whether they be philanthropists or others, wanted to be as precise as possible in the descriptions that they gave of poverty. And we've seen several examples. It's obvious that even if they exaggerated probably at times and generalized, they tried to be as realistic as possible. realistic in the sense of giving as many details as possible. These details may be warped or transformed and may not reflect reality, but at least this is how they perceived the reality of the time. The scrupulous honesty of humanitarians as guides to slum life. But what is particularly relevant here is this notion of mixture between facts and fiction. The fact that so many urban explorers wrote about their experiences in the East End of London, for instance, that novelists very often took the descriptions in the urban explorers' accounts, Charles Dickens, for instance, to establish a plot, to write a story around the same details. And so they, in a way, they confirmed, in a way, even if they probably had never been there themselves, they confirmed the vision that the urban explorers had of the poor neighborhoods. So this mix between fiction and reality was particularly obvious in the late 19th century. And at the end of page 6, the author writes, "The reformers were central to the construction of the urban geography of the bourgeois imaginary. Telling the case was an important way of shaping and affecting middle-class sensibilities and engaging support for action." And here you have the main idea at stake in these urban explorers' accounts. Very often they wanted people to react. And to make people react and either become a philanthropist themselves or deciding to do something for the community, for the poor communities, they wrote accounts that were particularly grim, particularly shocking for the bourgeois readers. But they shaped the way the bourgeois of the time saw poverty. Well, I don't have time to read with you the passage on which the critic explains the way poor children were called street Arabs at the time, but you'll read it on your own. But there's also a passage at the end of the text, page 14 or 692, in which Carolyn Taylor explains that all these texts were very often very melodramatic, because the rescue of these poor people were very often seen in a melodramatic light, as if the rescue of these people had to be staged, as if it had to be shown to the world as a great heroic deeds on the part of the bourgeois who would try to rescue these people. These people who, exactly as people from the colonies, were, according to the Victorians, unrescuable. Well, the word doesn't exist, but that they could not be rescued. They could not be rescued because they were not humans enough, in a way. This is exactly what they thought about foreigners. And to show the parallelism between the way foreigners were seen and the way poor people were seen, I would like to take in week 7 to 9 the last text of this booklet, which is a text written by General William Booth. General William Booth was a philanthropist. He was at the head of the Red Cross, if I remember well. And the text, or the chapter, is entitled More Crusades, and it's taken from a book which he wrote, entitled In Darkest England and the Way Out. In Darkest England and the Way Out. And of course, darkest England is poor England. It's the slums. Darkest England. So here not only does he use the word dark, but he uses the superlative form, darkest England, referring to the utmost poverty of some neighborhoods. And the first paragraphs are very relevant of the complete parallelism that there was between the colonists or the imperialists' approach to the colonists and foreigners, and on the other hand, the bourgeois approach or the philanthropists' approach to poverty. Look at the first paragraph. I have now sketched out briefly the leading features of the threefold scheme by which I think a way can be opened out of darkest England, by which its forlorn denizens can escape into the light and freedom of a new life. But it is not enough to make a clear broad road out of the heart of this dense and matted jungle forest. Its inhabitants are in many cases so degraded, so hopeless, so utterly desperate that we shall have to do something more than make roads. As we read in the parable, it is often not enough that the feast be prepared and the guests be bidden. We must needs go into the highways and byways and compel them to come in. So it is not enough to provide our city colony and our farm colony and then rest on our oars as if we had done our work. That kind of thing will not save the lost. Well, first, you see the religious overtone of the text, the lost that have to be saved. And they have to be saved by General William Booth and his, what he calls his slum sisters, that is the philanthropists, female philanthropists, that were going to the slums to try and help the poor and try to teach them religion or the basics of religion. So the religious dimension. The reference to the parable as well, which is typical of biblical language. Here you see the parallelism between the way Africa was called at the time, dark Africa, and the way he calls poverty, darkest England. Dark Africa, darkest England. And in each case, the darkness does not so much refer to the lack of light, but it refers to the lack of metaphorical light, that is, the lack of education, the lack of civilization, as the imperialists thought. You see as well that the East End is described in terms of jungle, the dense and matted jungle forest. And exactly as the imperialists had to make roads, to build roads in the forest, in the jungle, so as to develop the infrastructures in Africa, India, etc., he presents his role, or the role of his slum sisters, as making roads for the poor, and not only making roads from them, but bidding them to come to these roads. As if, exactly as foreign people, or colonized people, you remember the extract from The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, this idea that the imperialists did everything they could, and yet the people colonized didn't want of the help. That's how they felt it. And it seems that for the poor it's exactly the same. They make roads, they try to better them, this is the vocabulary that they used, and yet they do not want to to make the step forward that would help them out of poverty. The comparison goes even further in the next paragraph. It is necessary to organize rescue expeditions to free the miserable wanderers from their captivity and bring them out into the larger liberty and the fuller life. Talk about Stanley and Emin. Stanley is Henry Stanley, the explorer. There is not one of us but has an Emin somewhere or other in the heart of darkness England, whom he ought to sally forth to rescue. Our Emins have the devil for their Mahdi, and when we get to them, we find that it is their friends and neighbors who hold them back, and they are oh so irresolute. It needs each of us to be as indomitable as Stanley, to burst through all obstacles, to force our way right to the center of things, and then to labor with a poor prisoner of vice and crime with all our might. But had not the Expeditionary Committee furnished the financial means whereby a road was opened to the sea, both Stanley and Emin would probably have been in the heart of darkest Africa to this day. This scheme is our Stanley expedition. The analogy is very close. I propose to make a road clear down to the sea, but alas, our poor Emin, even when the road is open, he halts and lingers and doubts. First he will, and then he won't, and nothing less than the irresistible pressure of a friendly and stronger purpose will constrain him to take the road which has been opened for him at such a cost of blood and treasure. I now, therefore, proceed to sketch some of the methods by which we shall attempt to save the lost and to rescue those who are perishing in the midst of darkest England. Well, Stanley was an explorer. Henry Stanley, a great explorer of the time, and an imperialist, of course, considered to be a great explorer by the Victorians. And one of his missions was to save this Emin. So Emin, well, I don't know the exact story of Emin, but it was one of Stanley's mission to save Emin in the middle of the jungle. Yes. When he says, our Emins have the devil for their Mahdi, who is he referring to, our Emins?
The poor.
The poor. No S. The poor. The poor. Yeah, the poor, of course. Our Emin are the poor. So it means that Emin was the colonized. The poor are considered to be the colonized. The colonized within England, if you want. So our Emins have the devil for their Mahdi. Their Mahdi was their, what does it mean, Mahdi? Does anyone know what Mahdi means or not? Oh, it was a kind of, not God, but a kind of...
idol?
Yeah, that guided them, that guided Emin, yeah. Well, I'm not particularly familiar with the anecdote itself, but this is the idea that their Mahdi is someone they venerated, that Emin venerated. Yes, and you see here, for the poor, the one they venerate is the devil. So again, poverty associated with sin. Poverty associated with, yes, with the devil, with sin. Alcohol, prostitution, gambling, etc. Once again, a very essentializing vision of poverty. But especially, it's the idea of being held back. That is, not wanting to be improved, between quotes. As if poor people did not want to be helped, did not want to be improved. And so, you see how very melodramatic the description is, as if exactly as in a Rudyard Kipling's poem on the white man's burden, as if in fact they made the bourgeois, the philanthropists, suffer because they would not participate, or they would not make efforts in a way to be helped and to be saved. So he presents here the philanthropists exactly in the same way as the explorers, the imperialists, that is, as people with courage, as heroes who are going to fight all their life long to save people who do not want to be saved, for most of them. This is at least the way he sees things. And you see the parallelism between poverty and imperialism here, poverty and colonization. Obviously, in this text and in many other texts, it seems that saving the poor from poverty, one, is almost a kind of religious mission and can only be solved through religious education, because poverty at the time was associated with sin. And second, it is seen as a civilizing mission exactly as the mission of the British in the colonies was seen as a civilizing mission. Ok? Alors, on va s'arrêter là pour la partie sur la pauvreté. Et j'aimerais maintenant que vous preniez... Alors, vous allez prendre... que je ne vous dise pas de bêtises. Vous allez prendre... Puis alors, je l'ai pas... Attendez. Je retrouve le... Donc, ça va être 2 textes cette fois. Alors... Que je vous dise ça. Alors, vous prenez le texte, justement celui-là, de General William Booth. Vous le prenez depuis, que je ne vous dise pas de bêtises, vous le prenez depuis 24 Hours in the Slum jusqu'à la fin du texte. Donc, c'est sur la fin du texte. 24 Hours in the Slum, vous le voyez? Oh, c'est les 2 gros derniers paragraphes du texte.
29.
Vous voyez, page combien?
29.
29. Donc, page 29-30. Voilà, donc ça c'est le premier texte. Et le deuxième extrait, c'est dans l'article Slumming de Keith... oh, je sais jamais son nom celui-là. Keith Sloven? Non, c'est pas ça. Seth Coven, je me trompe tout le temps. Seth Coven Slumming. Vous voyez? Voilà, et c'est les pages 9-10. Enfin, c'est pas toutes les pages, mais c'est un extrait, page 9-10. Donc, c'est le dernier paragraphe de la page 9. Following Dios ou Dios. Vous voyez? Voilà, jusqu'à juste avant Who Went Slumming, donc la fin de The Varied Forms of Slumming Examined in this Book. D'accord? Bon, on n'a pas eu le temps de l'étudier, ce texte, mais il est vraiment important. Hein. Il explique bien la notion de slumming. Donc, The Following Dioses Lead jusqu'à The Varied Forms of Slumming Examined in this Book. Fin de la page 9, début de la page 10. D'accord? Alors, vous vous mettez en petit groupe, 2, 3, peu importe, 4 si vous voulez. Individuellement, on n'arrivera jamais à faire tout. De toute façon, c'est pas plus mal de travailler à plusieurs. Et puis, à la fin, vous m'envoyez votre plan. Hein? S'il n'est pas tout à fait fini, je peux l'accepter jusqu'à la fin de la semaine. D'accord? Allez, allez-y. Vous avez 1 heure, ce qui est le temps que vous aurez le jour de l'examen. Oral. Si vous avez des questions, vous m'appelez.
Merci.